Hi, Daniel, and
Good morning.
here to everybody who's joining us today. My name is Stuart Ellis. I'm the CEO of Charter School Capital, and I'm excited to be here with you today to discuss what to expect when you're expanding charter school best practices. Today, we have the privilege of having with us Daniel Hughes, the President and CEO of We Believe in Arizona. Daniel, I'm really excited to have you with us this morning. Thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about, or tell everybody a little bit about your background and We Believe in Arizona?
Sure. I wish that I could say that I was a hotshot, nationally renowned expert in education, but the reality is that's not really my background. I come from a mostly for-profit business in a variety of industries, and particularly commercial properties. But a few years ago, I met a school that was struggling, that had roughly 400 students, and was really looking at that school as a potential client. It was actually a cold call by an associate of mine. And we quickly realized that the school was struggling financially and wouldn't have any money to pay us even if we did win the account. But my heart was really kind of captivated by the student body and the leaders of the school and the school at that point. Stuart, actually, if you'd like to go on to the next slide, I'd be happy to kind of explain a few things as we go. That's the building there that I first saw, and we had considered, we were looking at actually taking over all the property management components in combination or cooperation with the landlord. And if you go on to the next slide, when I met some of these beautiful faces, I was really just kind of stricken. I had never imagined getting into education, but what I'd learned about this school, it had been around about 13 years at the time, and they, at the time, were exclusively serving very high at-risk families and students. The school at that time was a Title I school, and it was roughly 96% free lunch. But something that was fascinating to me was that the founder of the school had this vision that she would reach these highly targeted small pockets of students that she really wanted to reach and serve through transportation. So the transportation system that the school had was really unique and allowed the school to really kind of engineer the population that they were trying to reach, that they believed were the most at risk, and the students that were most in need of the services that the school could provide. And I just really fell in love with the whole concept. At that point, I didn't know if there was any money in it or if it could be a sustainable career or a business. I really just felt very strongly to volunteer and get involved and see where the relationship took us. The school began a little over 15 years ago now with less than 100 students in a little one-room storefront type facility, and now serves over 600 pre-K through 8th grade. We are in an expansion phase of our, what we call our child care center, which is separate from our pre-K program, but is still operated by the school and the same corporation. So by the end of this fiscal year, we should be over 700 heads on campus. We utilize a very wide range of funding sources. We operate 9 different federal programs, and of course we have our equalization or state funding programs, proposition monies that come in. We deal with a variety of different kinds of restricted funds, as well as retail sales for fundraising. And this year we've really started taking in some somewhat substantial donations. We're trying to reach a broad donor base to support some of our programs. When I met the school, what I did not realize the magnitude of what was happening at that time, but when I first walked through the doors, I didn't realize that the school was only about a month away from not being able to make payroll. With no options the school had through, there was a variety of reasons which we'll get into in some of the stages of growth, but Through mismanagement, the school leadership had radically overestimated their enrollment and counts, and on the very next equalization payment, they were going to be charged back more than the full value of the equalization payment. So essentially, the school was about a month away from closing its doors at that point. Long and short of it is, which we'll get into more details in a little bit, but over the course of the last couple of years that I've been officially connected with the school in more than just a volunteer capacity, we recovered from those catastrophic times and have added more than $2 million annually in revenues. And we did a top-to-bottom recreation of the entire organization, everything from curriculum, instructional staff, management, school leadership at the local level. So we've been very successful at taking concepts and skills that I've developed over years in working in a variety of different industries and then applying them to public education in Arizona. And we can't really come to any other conclusion than obviously it worked really well. And we essentially in a very short period of time had to really gather what the big picture could look like in the sustainable, mature version of who we want to be. What is that going to look like, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years from now? And then we really worked our way backwards to look at what decisions do we need to make right now to take the first step, second step, third step. Obviously, meeting payroll and paying rent is important. So I really had to look at our situation as being both a startup and a recovery, but it was also a very mature organization in the sense that it had been around a long time. So the leaders that were installed, much of the instructional staff that was there as well, some of the parents had been around for quite some time. So there was that fight against institutional memory. So as we go through each of these stages of growth that Stuart will lead us through, I have a very kind of unique perspective on what each of these phases look like for me, because we kind of had to do some of them and deal with many of these issues all simultaneously in order to survive and build towards that sustainable growth. And I'm really honored to be on the call because we view ourselves as a charity, and we believe in learning for all students in our country, and we believe that the United States has the potential to be a global leader in education, and particularly in the charter school movement. So I really value what Charter School Capital does and the partnership that we have with them.
Thank you, Daniel. So I think that people hearing about the details of what you walked through, how you've applied some of the things you've taken from your business experience in the past, applied them to the educational model, and really driving the growth of your organization, I think will be very interesting. From our perspective, I think it's a privilege to have you with us to go through that. By way of background, for those of you who are not aware, Charter School Capital is an organization that's now funded over 600 charter schools across the country, supporting more than 800,000 kids. As of now, we've funded over $1.8 billion into the charter school networks that we support. In our now we're coming to the end of our 10th year and are excited about that celebration. But with that, we bring perspective nationally on successful and unsuccessful charter school models. And as we go through things today, we want to talk about the various stages of growth of charter schools. We're going to talk about the challenges you as school operators face at each of those stages, and touch on best practices and takeaways, particularly from Daniel's perspective today. And for those of you who are seeing this and listening, You don't have to do screenshots or anything or be recording it. The entire presentation and the audio associated with it is available for download after the webinar today at charterschoolcapital.org/webinars. And there you can find examples of others from our past to the extent you want to get access to additional information. That said, let's talk about the various stages of growth at a high level and then drop into specifics from Daniel about each of these and how he and his organization have navigated these various stages as we go. So the way to step back, the way we think about these stages is, you know, you can over or undersimplify anything, but I'd say three basic pictures of stages of the life cycle of a charter school or of your institution. One is the startup phase, which is typically years 0 to 2 or 3, where you ramp up and get, say, up to about 25% of your student count. That could happen within months, but it could also, you know, take years. That said, early stage, and here the primary focus of the organization is simply to survive and get established. Think of this phase as the infancy of a child anyway, moving to the stage where they're walking. The growth or high growth phase, typically years 2 to 3 to years 5+, which ends with or could end with your first charter renewal or what have you, but really the way to think about it is you get to about 90% of your target mature population. The thing to note here is organizations are typically growing very fast here. They may triple in size over just 2 to 3 years, and that brings with it a whole set of new challenges that mean that what you need to be doing in this phase primarily is about being flexible and then establishing some stability. This is literally like a teenager or adolescent, you know, going through puberty. At the beginning of the stage, you know, you fit in one set of clothes. At the end, you may have grown, you know, like 5 sizes and are a almost completely different human physically. That's what happens to organizations. The sustainable maturity period, once you get over about 90% or you're in the target population size, some people look at this and say, well, we're pretty much done, you know, we just coast the rest of life. But actually, there's a whole bunch of new challenges here. And here the focus is on being as efficient as possible with a stable organization so that you can plow back in more and more economics to improve your academic and overall model for continuous improvement. So that's how we've thought about this overall. And when you think about it, there's a lot of, or news emphasizes a lot about charter school failures and those institutions that don't make it. That said, a study some 5 years ago identified that, like many other industries, 87% of the charter schools that fail in the country fail during the first 3 years, during that startup phase. And the reasons for this were identified here on this analysis, that although we hear a lot about academic issues and things like that, that the opposers of charter schools want to discuss, only 1 in 5 schools fail due to academic issues. 2/3 of the schools fail either for financial reasons or mismanagement, which really are tied together. The reason a school ends up failing for mismanagement is it runs out of money. And so 2/3 of the schools that do fail due to this financial or mismanagement issues. The other issues you can see on here, but again, I emphasize that this is 2/3 of the 87%, you know, and everybody is failing during the startup phase for the most part. 1 in 10 schools fail thereafter. So with that in mind, just a framework for some of the issues to consider, and Daniel, as he goes through these things, will talk about them in a distant sense. But from a framework standpoint, the 3 phases, startup, growth, and sustainability, we're going to touch on a variety of issues, but they can kind of be summarized across these 5 different categories. One is the financing issues in general and how you think about that at each of the 3 stages. Facilities challenges and how to address those strategically. What level of community involvement you feel and see and are targeting in each phase. A academic accountability, which is very different at each phase, and then how you should structure your operational support. With that in mind, each of the phases looks different in terms of the way to address it. And I'm going to have Daniel discuss these anyway as he goes through things in detail. But from a framework and summary standpoint, I'll just compare and say, for example, on the financing front, at the startup phase, all you're really looking for is any liquidity, any money, whether it's in the form of financing with interest expense or gifts or donations or anything like that, or just payment terms from vendors, anything that allows you to get rolling, you take. Pricing, although people think about that, pricing doesn't really matter here. It's just about getting the money so you can make it. When you get to the growth phase, it's about not having to do all the management time to change from one financing source to another every 3 months or 6 months as you grow in leaps and bounds. And then when you get out to a sustainable period, then where you have multiple options for sources of capital, then it's really about bidding people off each other, driving your costs down as much as possible, and being as efficient as possible to have more money left over to fund the organization. Similarly, you can see, the facilities issues going from just any location in the target locale all the way to curb appeal and cost savings. And as you go through these things, I think these are things we're going to touch on as we go, but this framework of very different challenges, targets, goals, strategic approaches in each phase, they really do change. Daniel, anything you'd like to add here as an overview before we drop into the specifics of the growth or the startup phase?
Yeah, I got just a couple of things. I appreciate what you said about taking some creative approaches to getting your hands on some liquidity in the early days. When I first met the school, which was then called Bradley Academy, and we've since rebranded, we had to go back and restructure every financial relationship that we had. So there were some vendors that had not been paid in a long time, and we wanted to get them paid. But once we had our plan together, we went and presented them with the plan. And obviously, some money over some period of time was better than no money over no period of time. And by and large, I was thrilled to see how many organizations were really willing to work with us, and sometimes even to their own great expense, to support our cause and what we believed in and our recovery effort. My accountant gets upset sometimes because even today, even though we have a great deal more liquidity than we did when I first met the school, I still will hoard cash. And that's exactly what I call it. I will let her know I'm going into a cash hoarding mode because I've just, evidence suggests we're going to need it in about a month. Something tells me some grant payments or reimbursements not going to come in on time, or through relationships with the Department of Education, I know that allocations are behind schedule and our Title I funding might not come through as we've built into our cash flow model. So we obviously, when I met the school, we were very reactionary, but now we're much more proactive, and we've used forecasting models and things to kind of see where we're going to be a month from now. Our goal is to be able to estimate right down to the dollar as of 11/59/59 on June 30th exactly how much is going to be in the bank account. And we have a software that helps us with that. But liquidity is cash is king, as they say, and it really does make a difference. We had one extra challenge when we started our recovery effort, and that was the school's credit was so bad that it was almost impossible to get credit terms through a number of vendors, and so we really had to take some creative approaches. And charter school capital really has saved us. Their understanding of the way that charter schools are financed and operate gave them a unique insight into who we are. And if it had not been for the liquidity added by charter school capital, it's really difficult to know how we would have pulled out of it.
Well, I expect you would have found a way, but I appreciate that.
Yeah.
That said, my experience is the bulk of the most successful schools are driven by the school leaders and their passion and their commitment, and frankly, the unwillingness of school leaders to let the disruptions and challenges of the early stage get in the way of the mission. So that said, why don't we drop into your thoughts on the startup, and we'll get into some of the details.
Yeah, sure. As we go through this, kind of at the 40,000 foot view or level, I'll just say that a lot of my language is going to be very startup-oriented language, but then also recovery language. And for those of you listening, perhaps some of you have had to go through the recovery process when things get really bad and you got to right the ship. But really the steps that you have to take aren't that dissimilar in a recovery as they are in a startup. Only I will say in the recovery, you do kind of have a 900-pound gorilla on your back. And so it is more of an uphill battle. It would be nice to be able to just let the sins of the past go, but they do have to be dealt with. But many of the steps that you have to take are pretty much the same. There was a Stages of Growth webinar that Stuart and other affiliates of Charter School Capital did previously, and I really encourage everybody to go to that website and that was mentioned on the earlier slide and listen to it because they have such a valid perspective and added a lot to me because they come more from education than I do. So we approach startup differently but get similar results, but the concepts are the same. So by and large, I've actually retained many of their talking points because I really wanted to expand and add my perspective to what's already been built on in the previous webinar. So I encourage everybody to go back and listen. The founding team to create best practice. Short and sweet, it is not necessary for you to reinvent the wheel in every program and every initiative that you have. There are experts available. There are schools who have been successful. Utilize them as resources. Go door knocking, cold calling. And most importantly, as we tell our students and our teachers, do not be afraid to ask questions. From a corporate branding, marketing, value proposition in the marketplace kind of perspective, I'm kind of prone to want newness. I like newness. I like the excitement of new things. But the reality is public education has been around a long time, and there are lots of great curriculum manufacturers or publishing houses out there. There's great software. We even have access now to Khan Academy. There's so many resources out there that are available. It is not necessary to reinvent the wheel. You got to partner with people who know. And some of the, and we'll touch on this in a resource bullet point later as well, but one thing I'm going to stress several times is leveraging relationships at the state level. Don't be afraid to communicate and collaborate with your Department of Education or whatever your equivalent is. Don't be afraid to use program specialists if you have federal grants to advise you and guide you. They are a wealth of knowledge and they work with a lot of schools. When I started knowing virtually nothing, I had to pull from every resource that I could.
Go ahead.
If you build it, oh, I'm sorry, did you want to add something, Stuart?
No, please continue.
Yeah, if you build it, they will come. This one's pretty simple too. Just because you put brick and mortar in the ground does not mean everybody's going to be, that wait list is going to be lined up along your fence line outside waiting to register. Something that was mentioned in a previous webinar that I absolutely loved was the charter operator that was hosting mentioned tell your story. And I enjoy telling our story. It's a little unusual. And the more that you can refine your story and get it down to some key points, especially what you believe and why you believe it, and tell that story over and over and over and let people experience it through your brand, through your literature, through your staff. the more engrossed in the community you will become, and we'll get to a little bit more than that about that in the growth and sustainability stages. But just can't assume that if you have a fancy flyer or if you have a nice building that has excellent curb appeal, that in and of itself is going to be attractive to anybody. You really got to know what it is that you're seeking as leaders and the demographics that you want to reach, and really work your way backwards. Understand who it is that you're trying to reach and what you're trying to do, and then engineer your message around that. Strong educational program is only one component. That's absolutely true. Something that I feel very strongly about, and just because I feel strongly about it and that it's right for me and our organization and that I promote it does not necessarily mean it's right for everybody. But I've had this belief that I've never understood why schools are just schools. I've always thought that they should be more community centers with more services and programming available for families and the community at large. And recently, I've kind of morphed that into another phase or level, and that is, I want to take our organization from being a school to a community center, and then from a community center to being the center of the community. And I think that perfectly correlates and coincides with the 3 stages of growth. Those 3 kind of classifications of our identity align to the 3 stages of growth, and we'll get more into those. I'm sorry, can you still hear me, Stuart? Am I back?
Yeah, so long as you've touched on some of these things already, I'll just flip over to see if there's anything
sure.
best practice you want to make. Go
ahead. Oh, yeah, thanks. So don't reinvent the wheel. Go out there, find resources. The associations are great. There's a lot of meetings. If you're our State Department of Education has a lot of actually really wonderful conferences. They're very good at the big trainings and meetings. Get involved in those types of things. Every year, our what we call our mega conference is great, and you can meet other schools, especially district schools that fascinate me. I enjoy talking to district school leaders and that operate more traditionally. I really glean a lot from them. So charter school operators offer a wealth of information and coaching, but some of my best learning opportunities has really come from data managers at school districts and superintendent level leaders. So I encourage you to call them up and go see them. Don't be afraid to make that cold call. Don't be a master of everything. One of the rules that I've applied to myself and to our staff, especially those at management or leadership levels, is if you can't keep your eyes on it, don't do it. So now again, that's not a universal doctrine. It's just something that's important to us and has helped us stay focused. And when I say if you can't keep your eyes on it, I don't mean micromanagement, but I do mean that if there's not a system in place for monitoring progress in any department and in any capacity, whether it's professional development and then what teachers learn in professional development being implemented with fidelity, or if it's student data, enrollment, cash, whatever it is, if you can't keep your eyes on it through some sort of established monitoring process, I strongly encourage you not to do it until you're ready to monitor it. You have to inspect what you expect, not to be cliche. And if you are unable to do that through whatever constraints, please tiptoe into it because it can go wayward in a hurry. One example I'll share, and we can move on, is that when I first met the school, federal programs were a mess. In fact, the school was in danger of being charged back by the state several $100,000 for inappropriately spent funds that were not allowable costs. So one of the first relationships I had to fix was our relationship with our program specialists and state directors, specifically Title I and our 21st Century After School Grant. we brokered a deal kind of off the books a little bit, where we weren't going to have the finding and we weren't going to be subject to the threat of having it charged back, but we had to reallocate funds over the next couple of years to basically kind of reinvest what should have been originally invested in student learning that really didn't get invested that way. And part of the reason that those programs went off the rails was because an expert was hired who basically copied and pasted another school's program into our grant application, and then our school was unable to meet any of those requirements or expectations. We were unable to fulfill those promises. So I believe in experts. You need to use them. You need to collaborate, but there is no substitute for knowing the law and knowing these programs yourself. If you don't have time to study and you don't have time to monitor, please be very careful in getting into some of these things. Let's go ahead and jump on to the next slide, if you don't mind, Stuart, because I think I can incorporate a few of these in some of the bullet points in the growth. I'm sorry, in the best practices. Is that where we were? Yeah, let me go ahead and jump down to budget, because I'll use budget as an opportunity to just talk about reporting mechanisms. So this ties into, if you can't keep your eyes on it, don't do it. And managing cash, managing budget, actuals to date. If everybody on the line operates a charter school, we already know that 1 month you can really be flying high and the next month can be challenging for a lot of reasons. Reimbursements come in late. In our case, school finance at the Department of Education has made a couple of errors that we didn't know were coming, and we kind of had to fight to get our money. And we've had some data failures in our student data management system, as well over the last couple of years that had to get worked out. So anything can happen, and or some sort of major expense comes along unexpectedly. Monitoring is important, so having a strong financial reporting process, whether you call it a budget or a cash flow forecast or whatever mechanisms that you're using in collaboration with your accounting staff, make sure that you're holding those experts accountable for producing that information for you in a timely manner and when you need it to make the best decisions. Those numbers can change pretty radically, and you having that information in your hands and then being able to disseminate that information to your leaders to set their expectations appropriately is important, and that really lends to your adaptability. And especially in the early stages. When we first met the school, we were lucky to make payroll, and thankfully we're well beyond that now, and things are much more predictable, and we have mastered certain things, but still I always kind of budget and assume the worst and really keep an eye on cash. Student data progress, for student performance. We have a variety of mechanisms that we use for this, but they're all virtual. They're all in the cloud. We actually adapted the Salesforce platform, which was a carryover from my more entrepreneurial experience, and have turned it into our own kind of charter operation-wide unified platform. And basically my rule has been, if I can't see it and monitor it from my iPad, then we need to make an effort to get whatever processor system that is into the cloud so that I can. And student data is critically important to that process. Teachers load data regularly, and all of that data is visible. Goals are important, expectations are important, but if you can't see where you're at on any given day, you really don't know if you're making progress towards those goals. So we've developed our own system for that because I was unable to find a system out there in the education world that I liked, that I thought gave me the visibility into the data that I really wanted. And if anybody would ever like any advice on how to set something like that up, I'd be glad to provide that. And last but not least, don't ever waver from your belief or mission. I'm sorry, Stuart, were you going to jump in there?
No, go ahead. I'm sensitive to the time we have today, and I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to go through the growth and maturity phases.
Oh, sure.
As we think about that, as we think about or go from, excuse me, the early stage to this high growth phase, one of the things we wanted people to recognize is the economic benefits of growth. It's interesting that a lot of charter leaders who don't necessarily have or are focused on the academic model and may have less familiarity with the economics of running an institution or organization like this, don't often have access to tools or experts who can guide them through the math or the economic analysis of what happens in a situation with growth. Most people think about, in order to grow, I have to make investments. I have to recruit students, which costs marketing dollars. I have to expand my facilities, which you need capital dollars for, and I may need to finance or fund some expenses early, and as such, there may be some financing or borrowing required in order to do that. And then most people would look at that and say, and there I'm going to have interest expense or other financing costs. And as a result, we'll be in a worse financial situation. But the reality of growth investments is that an investment in growth that's successful is actually accretive, generating more money for the organization, more surplus, more dollars to invest in your academic program, et cetera. This tool, the growth estimator that we have here, is a tool where we've taken across the 600 schools across the country and other states. We've built a tool by which charter leaders can use this to think about, given if we want to grow to X students, what does that look like? What are the costs? What are the investments required? And how does that play out in terms of total dollars? And here's a quick picture for an example school, a very cool charter school in the state of California. They start with enrollment, as you can see in the upper left quadrant of this chart, about 400 students. Their facility can hold 575, and there's a student-teacher ratio built in, and their estimate to recruit a new student is $700 per student, which is about the average across the country. That said, in the lower left quadrant, you can see that we've built out based on averages across the country for different types of schools, site-based schools, blended learning models, and online schools. This example being a traditional site-based school. The averages for the percentage of revenue spent on each of various expenses in your income statement or your P&L. And here we have 4 scenarios running. The school doesn't grow at all, 0% growth, and you can see the revenues for this example school, and they operate at break even. A 10% growth, or an addition of about 40 kids, 25% growth, or an addition of about 100 students, and 50% growth, or an addition of about 200 students. And the key point of the 50% growth category is you have to expand your facility because they don't have room in the existing facility. Then down below you can see the growth capital required given the investment in facilities, the investment in student recruiting, and the early phase of getting teachers on board or ordering computers, textbooks, furniture and fixtures, et cetera, that are necessary to serve the new students coming. However, you can see down at the bottom the additional surplus generated beyond that capital on an annual basis. So we'll translate all this math to the right, which is on the right you see in the upper right hand quadrant you see 2 lines. One is the gold line for the revenues generated by the organization, and the blue line or expenses points out that at 400 students the organization breaks even. However, as it grows and expands, that space between the gold or revenue line above the blue expense line is actually highlighting that as the organization grows and expands, because of scale benefits and one-time costs that go away, you generate a greater and greater surplus, which can be kept by the organization in reserves, or more likely is reinvested in the program itself, in better academics, enhanced facilities capability, better student-teacher ratios, other support programs that can be provided, whatever you think makes sense. But it basically generates more money for your organization. And down in the lower right quadrant here, the discretionary surplus is built out. As such, you can see that you've got, on an annual basis in year one, at each level, you can see the surplus generated: 200,000 for 10% growth, 400,000 for 25% growth, and 650,000 for 50% growth. So long as you're spending less than that in that year on the cost of the investment capital required, this is an accretive transaction for the organization. You can see as you get out to 5 years out, the organization generates $1.2 million, $2.3 million, and $3.8 million for the 5-year cumulative numbers. And if you go further out for 10 years, you can see you start running 4, 5, 7, or 8 million in cumulative impact. Think about the impact to your organization. That is like you received that much money in donations by just growing. So the financial impact of growth is very significant, and we just want people to understand that even when you make the investments in the financing or other aspects that you have to have, once you get the students in, they remain. Retaining students is much easier than adding new students. So with that, Daniel, you want to talk through some of the things? We have about 15 to 20 minutes for the remainder of the webinar. Think about that as you go through things and highlight those things you think are most impactful in the growth and maturity phase. We can skip to any part of the presentation you want. The rest of the material is there for everybody to read afterwards anyway.
Yeah, sure. I can actually kind of tie a few of these points and common misperceptions together. The first, after the third year, all will be in place and it's smooth sailing. You know, my experience is that we're really going into the third year of what I would call our startup, or I should say our recovery phase, and we definitely have made a lot of progress. But adaptability is important, and reassessing systems from every angle continuously is important, and in fact a common term is having a continuous improvement process in place. I don't know that, I mean, for me, that there's really any such thing as, you know, quote unquote smooth sailing, because if it gets that smooth, then I'm itching for growth. But being open-minded and ready to learn is important. Accountability is really critical. People have a tendency to become complacent, and tying performance and accountability into a kind of a merit-based or positive behavior intervention system for leaders, teachers, students, everybody who's involved in your culture is important. And it's very important because oftentimes expectations or standards will change. Our state of Arizona has gone through 2 standardized tests since I've been involved in charter operations. Our state standards have changed twice. Title 15, which pertains to state statutes pertaining to education, have been amended. Many changes have occurred, and those reach right into the classroom. So having a process in place to monitor performance and accountability is important, because as those changes come up, and they will, it's a lot easier if you have a robust system that everybody understands and knows already implemented and that is adaptable. Professional development never ends. I love teachers. However, I will say that my experience so far has been is that teachers sometimes are the worst learners. Sometimes teachers are the worst students. And what I have found is that sometimes the certificate almost promotes this idea that they already are the expert. And our learning should never stop at any level of leadership management. If you're a teacher, student, if we want to convey that learning is important to children, then we ourselves need to embody that quality. And there are new tools, resources, curriculum, technology on the market and available every day. So staying in touch with those things and having a professional development process for everybody at all levels is really critical. No need to change routines and systems. There will always be a need to change routines and systems. Just get used to that kind of ever-evolving continuous improvement process. Cash management and managing the balance sheet over time is important. Having financial goals out in front of you and knowing the steps that's going to be necessary, much like in the previous slide how Stuart showed, if it's 0% growth versus 10% growth versus 50% growth, here's what the net effect of that will be. This type of tool is priceless. I strongly encourage you to use this type of tool as well as others. I also encourage you, another component to finance that needs to be addressed is financial performance frameworks as rolled out by respective states. I don't know what they're called in every state. That's what our charter board calls our financial expectations. So either developing your own tool or asking somebody to give you one or buy it from somebody that can help you forecast whether you will or will not meet your authorizer's financial expectations each fiscal year is also important. And if you don't, they're going to ask you for a corrective action plan. So having that type of information is critical to really knowing whether or not you're going to have the liquidity and the balance sheet to support future expansion. Don't automatically assume that the funds will be there just because you're running a super awesome school. Facility upgrades will be minimal, if at all. We've already, just going into this school year, had to reallocate several areas of our building. That one used to be a dance studio. We had to turn it into 2 classrooms. We had to really get creative, and we are eager over the next 18 months to 2 years looking at a master plan as to how to put more bodies on our campus. And enhancing the current facility is really important. Things break, staying on top of preventative maintenance is important, but also, we've gone through 2 iterations of technology improvements just in the time that I've been around. So keeping in mind how to facilitate facility improvements as you move forward is important, and key partnerships are important to that. Next slide, please.
Let's, Daniel, with the time we have left, I want to make sure you have an opportunity to go through the planning approach that you have at the back end. Is there anything you'd say to summarize these elements in growth, and perhaps we can move this personal affirmation material that you included?
Yeah, actually, all of these will be addressed in the other slides if you'd like to skip there.
Okay. Do you want me to touch? Do you want to touch on this piece here, and then we'll go to the other section that you have?
Yeah, getting our culture unified was very important. Parents, teachers, students, school leaders, I really wanted using the same language. So we developed this personal affirmation, and everybody goes through this every day, and we have it posted around the school, and all the students recite this. And it is, I believe that I have a purpose. I serve an important role in our community. I am an open-minded learner. I will learn using my eyes, ears, and whole body. I am empathetic and mindful. I care for you, and you care for me. If we are learning and growing, we are successful. We achieve more together. And this as much applies to me and our teachers as it does our students. Next one.
All right. Anything you want to say as an overview as we go to this transition to, okay, you've blown through all the growth targets, you're settling out at some sustainable level. Whether you've stopped growing or not is a question for the organization, but you're at some sustainable economic level now.
Right.
Anything you'd like to say as we drop into this, and and I'll move to these materials here that you laid out on the various teaching models. But anything you want to say about the stage in general?
Yeah, the sustainability stage of growth, the way that we really looked at it, and especially me coming into the industry blind, we really had to assess what does a sustainable organization look like, and then we really worked backwards from that. So we looked at finance, we looked at academic, and we looked at operations. We studied the expectations of the Charter Board, the Department of Education, and the kind of the underwriting process of organizations like Charter School Capital. What do they really look for? What is a healthy balance sheet for them? What would make us investable? And if you can't answer that right now, then I encourage you to take a close look at that. So for us, we knew that if we were going into this, that we wanted to save the current school, but I was really compelled to want to have some understanding of how to more proliferate our message and replicate. And so my question was, well, right from the beginning, how do we start building an organization with that eventual goal in mind? And we do have a growth strategy, which actually, Stuart, unless you have anything else to add to this, we could jump to our growth plan, which is just a couple more slides up.
Yeah, here you go, page 30.
Let's see, two more. I think two more.
Oh.
There we go. Yeah, perfect. And we can stay right here on this one. This works fine. So in the very so Generation 3 is kind of that dream scenario where we knew we had to build, if we wanted to replicate basically exponentially, where we could take one school, turn it into two schools into 4 schools. This Generation 3 is that third step in the growth and expansion process once sustainability has been achieved for us. And we're kind of on the outer edge of that stage 2 growth now. We are at cap, so we actually cannot put any more state-funded kids in our building until we expand. But we're still coming out of the woods. We still have debt. We still have partnerships where the financial relationship needs to be paid off and get ourselves free of some things and really start investing in our growth and expansion. And so we just put together this kind of a plan and vision, and everybody sees this. Our teachers see it, our leaders see it, to keep that knowledge of where we're going out there, and that the decisions that we're making today in every area need to be moving us towards that eventual goal. One problem that we have in Arizona is that we have a teacher shortage right now. So Stuart, if you don't mind going back 2 slides. So professional development, our universities and colleges are not putting out a lot of teachers right now, and so we developed what we call a collaborative teaching model, where essentially we take kind of a rookie teacher, pair them with a highly skilled and experienced teacher, and essentially grow or farm our own talent from within. If anybody would like more information on this approach, I'd be glad to provide it. But essentially, we really had to take responsibility for producing our own high-quality instructors, and we are in the beginning stages of this, because in order to facilitate our future expansion and growth, we're going to need high-quality teachers that can replicate the instructional programming that we're finding success in now at new campuses or at the current campus as we add more classrooms. And then we can go ahead and jump let's see, a couple more. There we go. It was a big belief of mine that everybody should be participating as one unified culture and on the same page about what expected behaviors are. What is it to be part of this team and a good citizen? So we created this program called Band of Hope, and if you can go to the next slide. It's based on a Martin Luther King speech where he talks about stones of hope. So the band of hope looks like the bracelet down there on the bottom right. And if you go to the next slide, each of the stones represent a different character trait that we're trying to instill in those who are affiliated with our organization. Everyone who participates, whether they are a student or a staff member, can earn these beads through demonstrating these various character traits. And the next page kind of looks into how the rubric as to how we monitor that and define that. But what was important to me is what's good for the student is good for the teacher. What's good for the teacher is good for me. What's good for me is good for the community. And really wanted us all operating in a unified culture. And so we created this system to do that. And we track all of this digitally as well. We have a platform for that. But when we talk about going out in the community and building community support and awareness, we use programs like this to do it. So these last 5 or 6 slides, I'll just tie together simply that having what the end result will look like someday in front of you in every area of what you're trying to achieve, for me, is very important. It helps me know if I'm meeting key benchmarks along the way, and it helps me know if I'm being an effective leader. So regardless of what your different programs are, I do encourage, if you don't have something that kind of looks like this, or like the growth calculator that Stuart showed you earlier, then I strongly encourage you to start putting those things together and ask for help to put those things together so that you can monitor your progress and growth as you go. Oh, you know, we can skip the leap, Stuart, because we're running short on time.
Okay. Well, anything that you, I guess I'd say we've had a few questions as we've gone, quite a few actually today, but I think we've addressed most of them. One of the questions from one of the people on the webinar today is there an ideal minimum number of students for a startup charter? And I guess I would say to anybody out there, you know, the minimum you start with in your first year is not really as significant as whatever you're trying to get to or how quickly you achieve that. Your ability to start up, whether it's with 10 students, 100 students, or 1,000 students, is a function of what you had available to you in terms of investment capital, whether it's from investors or donors or what have you. So you can start smaller, but you have to have the cash to actually do things at that level. You can start bigger, but you have to have the cash to make that happen. And I'd say I would think more about the total minimum student population to be a sustainable organization rather than how many students you have when you open the doors. There's no real way to know how many kids will be there on day one or as you roll throughout the year. Our experience really is that anything below, we do have some schools that have been around for a long time at under 100 kids, but our experience is that is a very unstable and or difficult organization to sustain. There's just not enough in terms of the economic support for an organization like that, community support, et cetera, to really sustain that over time. And even there are organizations that operate below 200, including you know, one organization in Arizona that a few years ago, it's been around for nearly 20 years, and a few years ago was Charter School of the Year in Arizona. That said, they range between 150 and 170 kids, but at below 200, our experience is also difficult. Below 100, nearly impossible to sustain that organization over time. So those are things I would think about. It's less about how many kids you have in year one as a startup, but really, what does a sustainable organization look like? And I think it has a lot to do with what Daniel has just been saying about, you know, get started, and with the end in mind, you can kind of back up from there. It's not really an end anyway. It's more like you start with the goal in mind and back up the steps. What does it take to get there? So,
yeah, indeed. And I would only add, if you don't mind, just the operational component. If you're going to start with 200 kids, that means you need X number of teachers, X number of administrators. And if you don't have the human resources process in place to recruit and retain and coach and professionally develop, and monitor those individuals, well, then you're probably starting out too big. So you've got both the fiscal component, but then you have the operational and talent component. How much can you actually manage in order to get high quality returns and output early? You don't want to find yourself spiraling out of control right out the gate.
I'd also add that starting up a charter school, like starting up almost any other organization in the world, is a very, very difficult execution. That venture is hard. Starting up anything is difficult. And mostly what you need is a commitment to the mission of the key leaders of the organization, that you're just going to make it happen no matter what. Because whatever the plan looks like and however beautifully conceived, my experience is that every startup organization and every growth organization faces challenges they were never expecting, that couldn't have been anticipated, and that are surprises. And to get through that, it mostly is about commitment, character, and your ability to link with partners across the board to make your vision become a reality. It is hard, but it is incredibly rewarding. That said, I want to say at this point, thank you very much, Daniel, for joining us. I learned a lot today, and I expect our participants and listeners in the webinar who have not dropped off as we've gone through this seem to be really engaged and excited about what's going on. For those of you on the webinar today, you can contact either of us. The information is here if you have follow-up, and please do feel free to download and share the webinar materials and/or recording today at charterschoolcapital.org/webinar. Daniel, anything you have to add?
No, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We appreciate your interest in the webinar today. Thank you.